U.S. President Donald Trump has arrived in Washington after his summit with DPRK leader Kim Jong-un. He said Pyongyang no longer posed a nuclear threat and the DPRK was no longer America's biggest problem. But any deal reached at the crucial summit in Singapore will have to pass the test of time. So I asked a long-time diplomatic observer from the United States to recall the history of interactions between the DPRK and the U.S. Let's listen in. And I'm joined by Jonathan Pollack, non-resident senior fellow in the John Thornton China Center and Center for East Asia Policy Studies of the Brookings Institution. He's also one of those instrumental persons contributing ideas to the issue of Korean Peninsula nuclear issue. Mr. Pollack, welcome to our program. If I could begin by asking you, Mr. Pollack, the fact that the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue has been on the top of the agenda line of presidents of the United States. Clinton, George W. You also have Obama and now Trump. So how usually these presidents, who are not experts of international relations, learn about the issue?
Well, of course, this issue specifically has evolved a great deal over time. The issues with which President Clinton grappled with are very different from the ones now that President Trump is presumably grappling with. I think in the case of most presidents, what they learn about this issue comes in early intelligence briefings that they might receive upon becoming president. And hopefully that provides a basis on which policy can then be deliberated and decided. The other issue, of course, though, is whether or not there's any kind of an ongoing context or process for interactions with North Korea. Often there is not. So on that basis, the president has to decide how high a priority will this be, what will be the goals that any president will be trying to achieve, and how much will it also depend on relations with others.
Usually, how long in their presidency, how much into their presidency already that presidents of the United States would realize what kinds of approach they would take toward the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue? Well,
on that, presidents are often very reactive to actual events or discoveries. If we could take just recent presidents as an example of this, when President George W. Bush came into office, the Korean nuclear issue was already very much on the radar screen because of the agreed framework that had been achieved with the Clinton administration. But the agreed framework was already in big trouble at that point. But it took precipitating events in the context of President Bush, intelligence findings that suggested that North Korea had a separate covert uranium enrichment program apart from what the agreed framework was slowing down. In the case of President Obama and in the case of President Trump, both of them were reacting to very visible events, real-world events. I remember very clearly the second time I visited North Korea was about 2 weeks after President Obama was inaugurated. North Korea had a rocket on the launch pad to launch a satellite, and very soon thereafter, after North Korea proceeded with that launch, it then proceeded with another nuclear weapons test. So he had to grapple with it very immediately, and Trump very much the same, based on both real-world events, that is to say, sustained and accelerated weapons testing and missile testing, and also projections by the intelligence community that an ICBM capability could be achievable by North Korea in the not-too-distant future.
Mr. Pollack, you were called in by the Obama administration 2013. That was the time to brief President Obama in his Oval Office about what exactly is going on with the nuclear issue on the Korean Peninsula. Do you still remember exactly how things were being discussed? And what is the format when the president is listening to different opinions coming from scholars and also coming from officials from different parts of the branch of the government?
Well, one small correction, it was not in the Oval Office, it was in the Roosevelt Room, where many of these meetings are held. The Roosevelt Room has much more of a seminar-like quality. You're sitting around a big table on opposite sides of a table. You can accommodate at the table maybe about 6 or 7 people on either side of the table.
What kind of the others, you know, besides you who is a scholar, who are the other people that usually, the type of people being selected to brief the president?
It depends very much on the president in question. It happened that President Obama was very, very interested in occasional interactions like this, where he would call in some prominent experts. The other 4 people were there are all very, very well known. I don't want to go into names, but they were very renowned scholars in their own way from different aspects of these questions. President Obama was very, very comfortable with that kind of a format. I'm unaware that President Trump has had any outsiders in to brief him on these issues. He tends to rely, to the extent that he's relying on anyone, and again, he's been concentrating a lot on trying to understand these issues better. He relies primarily on those from the intelligence community, as I understand it. Perhaps now, because Mr. Pompeo has moved from the CIA to the State Department, he may be calling on some State Department people to greet him. What
are the factors that's eventually going to decide the policies and the approach of an American president toward the DPRK issue and also toward the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue? Is it, given your previous knowledges interacting with the American president, domestic politics? Is it strategic goals of the United States in the region and beyond? Is it the current affairs of the day that is the president has to deal with? Is it the balance of different issues? Is it about, you know, the economic and trade, the priorities that the president has to struggle with? What exactly is it if you look back at some of your discussions and the results?
I think it depends very much president to president. And again, the contrast between Obama and Trump is very, very great. Obama was making a set of underlying strategic calculations. If Trump was, or is, I should say, President Trump is very, very tactical in his approach, very immediate, very reactive. The question of whether he is prepared to absorb information from experts, whether within the government, from the outside, very different from President Obama. And so, as we know, the amount of tumult and turmoil almost in American decision-making leading up to the summit meeting in Singapore has been extraordinary. I don't see anything that would have been remotely similar under President Obama, even as the press of events dictates certain kinds of actions.
But Mr. Polak, you also see that President Trump has been changing his way of portraying the importance and significance of the summit.
He has said all along, I'm not going to go down the path that other presidents have followed, which was really directed mainly at President Clinton and President Bush, not at President Obama, because President Obama never really sustained an open-ended negotiating process with North Korea. But now we see Trump maybe being a little bit more realistic, looking at his real options as opposed to ones that are just more magical thinking. Essentially is talking about a process that, even if we don't know exactly yet what will evolve in the aftermath of the Singapore summit, it looks a lot like a protracted negotiating process that President Clinton undertook in various ways, and certainly President Bush. It does suggest to me that Trump or some around him really took a harder look, not at the bumper stickers, the grandiose claims about we're going to do this and we're going to do that, but rather somewhere a more strategic judgment has seemed to evolve. The question for President Trump, because he's very, very tactical, he's not a strategic operator, the question is whether this will persist after the summit.
Thank you so much, Jonathan Pollack, a scholar who has been working on the Korean Peninsula nuclear issue for decades. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing your experiences and stories with us. Thank you for your insights.